Hi, my name is Amy Peeler. I'm Associate Professor of New Testament at Wheaton College and Graduate School.
Dr. Amy Peeler. Amy, great to see you.
Great to be with you. Glad to speak about the text this morning with you.
Oh, listen, this is a fun text. I used to do these daily Bible reading things, right? And so whenever I got to Matthew chapter 1, I would just kind of skip over, about
Right,
16
right.
verses, as I recall, because all that seemed to be was just a bunch of names of people that I
Right.
couldn't pronounce at the
Yes.
time. And so it seemed totally uninteresting to me. But now that I've been reading and studying this stuff for a while, it's really a fascinating
Oh,
genealogy.
absolutely. This is one of my favorite moments in New Testament where we linger here a bit and students' eyes usually light up seeing things that they haven't noticed before.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. And your book that you've written, Women and the Gender of God, which has just appeared recently, is doing very well, and it asks really a lot of great questions about God the Father, Jesus the Son, and Mary, and this whole notion of the genderedness of the Trinity in a way.
Right. Right. And I hope it's clear that's not a politically correct, trendy kind of question. Christian and before that, Jewish language for God is gendered.
Yeah.
And our story, especially the Christian's story, the fact that a pregnancy stands at the center of our story demands that we take these issues seriously. So I hope mine is just one small contribution to the many who have wrestled with these issues and seen the awesomeness of God, that God was willing to enter into the human story itself.
Yeah, that is what makes all the difference, isn't it?
Absolutely.
All right, so let's talk a little bit about the genealogy. As you look at it, I mean, there's lots of names. It starts
Yeah.
with Abraham, and
Right.
I
Right.
find that the very beginning, the Biblos Geneseos Jesu Christu Wiu David Wiu Avraham. That word Geneseos, it's
Yes.
often translated genealogy, the book of the genealogy,
Yeah.
but it seems to me that that's maybe a wrong way of thinking about it too. What do you
Well,
think?
yeah, I think that's it's meant to be, and even orally one can hear it, that geneseos, Genesis, right?
Yeah.
I think in a way that is resonant with what John does at the beginning of his gospels in Arche Halagos, right?
Hmm.
He's kind of going back to the beginning, starting with the same language as the Septuagint of Genesis. I think so too with Matthew. He says, I'm going to start at the beginning. Now, he puts his attention on the covenant people by lifting up Abraham,
Hmm.
but he is focusing on the beginning point of Jesus's humanity, and Jesus enters into a particular family, a particular narrative, a particular tribe. It is his interest into God's elect people.
Yeah, yeah. As it moves through, you just kind of go through these names and you see these connections. I remember hearing a sermon years ago about the grandmothers of Jesus. I thought
Oh,
that was
yeah.
kind of a creative way of doing it, and they focused in upon some of the women. The
Mhm.
sermon did on related to this particular genealogy because it's not in Luke. Luke doesn't have these women mentioned.
That's right.
As much as Luke seems to be really interested in the women around Jesus, they're not
Yes.
mentioned in the genealogy. But Matthew mentions them here.
Fascinating. Yes, yes. I puzzle at times, though I wonder if I'm kind of privy to the idea that Luke knows Matthew and is building upon him.
Yeah.
So who knows?
Yeah,
But
I
but
think you're
it's a
probably right. Yeah.
glorious, yeah, it's a glorious inclusion for Matthew. It's that kind of first tip of his hat that this good news is for the Jewish people, and as God promised Abraham in Genesis 12, for everyone through them. So you get
Hmm.
the inclusion of these women who, some of them are not ethnically Israel. So
That's exactly right. But they enter into the family, right? They
yeah,
come into the family.
exactly.
So what
Yes.
do you make of what do you make then of the inclusion of women in here?
Yeah.
That's part of what is happening here. Anything else that you think is happening in this particular
Mm.
genealogy?
Wow, this is such a rich place of reflection. So I first want to name that Matthew is not the only author or the first author to mention these women. Clearly, we know their stories because they're included in the Old Testament. And
Right.
so there's no kind of idea of, oh, no one's ever mentioned them before. He's kind of drawing from different traditions where their stories are prominent.
Mm.
And we've got Tamar and Ruth and Rahab. And interestingly, I do let my students know this. This is a great Greek moment.
Mm.
But in verse 6, and David begat Solomon from the one of Uriah. Often English translations will say Bathsheba, but she's actually not
She's not
named there.
mentioned. Yeah.
No, she's named as the wife of Uriah.
Right.
Um, so there's so much going on here. I really appreciate a chapter, a reflection by Catherine Sackenfeld. It's in a volume on Mary called Blessed One, where she wrestles with the different ways these stories have been interpreted. One common question is there a thread connecting all of them? Why these women and not others? We don't get Sarah
Yeah,
or
you would think
Rachel or Rebecca,
Sarah's
right?
right. Right.
And so I think part of it is the inclusion of Rahab, the Canaanite, Ruth,
Mm-hmm.
the Moabitess. So
Mm-hmm.
these people who are on the edges or outside the people of Israel, it is that inclusion of the Gentiles that will kind of be a glimmer in Matthew until the very end. Often in some older interpretations, it was remembered that these women, some of them are prostitutes or act as prostitutes.
Mm.
Tamar does so when she is treated unjustly,
Mm-hmm.
when she is not given kind of the right of to marry a brother. And so for survival, she dresses as a prostitute, and Judah himself encounters her.
Mm.
And then what is Rahab? She's a prostitute. And even with Bathsheba, of course, it's of no fault of her own, but her story is a broken story.
Mm-hmm.
And so sometimes you'll hear, look, God can work through broken situations. I think that's absolutely correct, but one needs to be quite careful that really, if you read these stories carefully, these women aren't just bad women.
No,
No, they
no.
are often mistreated. And so if there's redemption happening here, it's of the entire brokenness of perpetrators against these women. And
Yeah.
this is the messy that our Savior enters into.
Well, I think a good example is what you just mentioned is that David fathered Solomon through the wife of another man. Right? I mean,
Precisely.
David is the broken one here. I mean,
Exactly.
badly broken. I had a rabbi
Absolutely.
friend in Israel, and he said that David broke 9 out of the 10 commandments.
Oh my. Totally. Yes.
I have never counted them, but it seems like, well, probably that's right, you know?
Yes.
So
Yes.
that brokenness is not just broken women, but broken
No.
people,
Yeah. Broken systems
broken systems.
in which women often have to survive. And I think that actually gives modern purchase on discussions about trafficking, right? So very often these aren't free choices, but conscription. They're bound in some way. And so
Hmm.
that's a really healthy approach. It does. I have wondered, and so we have the inclusion of outsiders. You have these kind of questionable stories, especially in the realm of sexuality. It seems to me that Matthew is mentioning them not only for the reality of redemption, but to almost tip his hat that he said, hey, I'm about to tell you a story that might raise your eyebrows. And
Mm-hmm.
so I want to remind you that there have been these, unmentionable stories in his line. I'm going to tell you one that might seem that way, but it's really different. So almost as a stark comparison, yeah, there's nothing untoward in Mary's story,
Right.
even though people on the outside might wonder. Or
Yeah.
Joseph might have wondered, right? When he decides to put her away quietly, what could his assumption be other than she's been unfaithful or violated?
Right.
And so I wonder if Matthew's kind of prepping his readers to see that distinction, that
Yeah.
difference.
One of the things that I've said about the genealogy, I don't know if I'm right here, but I always leave open the possibility that I am, is that one of the charges leveled against Jesus is that he is a friend of sinners throughout all of his
Oh,
ministry,
yes,
and that
right.
as a friend of sinners, I mean, he comes from a line of broken people and messed
Mm,
up stories,
yes,
and that it's not to say that he himself is messed up. It's just if these messed up folks have brought to us the
yes,
Messiah, the
right,
Son of the living
right.
God, then what can happen with the rest of us who maybe have not broken all 9 of the 10 commandments, but we've broken some of them, right? So what about our own stories kind of entering into that?
That is so powerful. Again, just that beauty of a holy God, sovereign God. There's no question of God's being God, and yet the willingness to enter exactly into the stories in which humans find themselves, which are not perfect stories.
Yeah. So you speak on a regular basis, and you're a minister yourself. So maybe one day you might do a sermon called "The Grandmothers of Jesus."
I think that's a beautiful idea. Absolutely.
Well, very
Yeah,
good.
there's much to be, and normally what I have my students do, so if someone wants to press a little bit deeper, is to go and reread everything that's said about these women in Israel's scriptures, and then carry those stories into the life of Jesus. And always students find just powerful points of connection. There's such a richness in that comparative Old Testament, New
Yeah.
Testament work that I don't think you can really ever get to the depth of it.
No, and Rahab has such an interesting story. It's celebrated several times in the book of Joshua, and then
Right.
even in the book of Hebrews, as you know. I mean,
Yes. Yes.
she's there again, being celebrated for what she did to contribute to the redemption of Israel.
Yes. Absolutely. There's a validity to that kind of storytelling. If you were going to make up a savior, you'd have a real squeaky clean story.
Yeah.
And the fact that that's not the case, I think, is given evidence of Matthew saying, "Hey, I'm going to tell it like it is."
Excellent. We're so glad, Amy, all the times we get to speak to you. Thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Thank you.
What a great conversation. I hope you agree. Now, there's only 168 hours until the next podcast drops, so watch for it. Subscribe to this podcast, rate us today. If you want to study biblical languages, you need to consider Wheaton College. They have the best program in the country, bar none. Go to wheaton.edu, look for modern and classical languages. Get started today. Come on, you know you want to. Thanks for those who make this podcast possible. John Lonsma is our Wheaton-based director, Ian Rosine, and Rebecca Larson. Thanks to Phil Keggy for our music. Until next time, thanks for listening.